My name is Renata Uitz, and together with Bernard Rourke at the other end of the table, we will have the hopefully happy task of moderating this panel. And we agreed with Bernard with very minimalist moderation, since some of the themes were laid out already. And those of you who were here for the first panel, which was more concentrating on content-based restrictions, our task is to look at the imminent danger test and the extent to which the emphasis on protection against hate speech or hate speech regulation should focus on the context of this speech. So without much ado, the first speaker of the panel is probably known to everyone in the audience. This is Dunja Mijatovic, the OSCE representative on freedom of the media.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the invitation. It's wonderful to be back in Budapest. It's wonderful to be among friends and colleagues. I haven't been here for quite some time, but some of the most important presentations I had in my previous career happened actually in this very room. And as Andrei said in his address, he spoke here about hate speech on several occasions. I did as well. And I will try not to repeat myself, even though I do not know, to be very honest with you, what new to tell you, which kind of new formula to offer when it comes to hate speech and how should we deal in our societies with hate speech as a phenomenon. Coming from where I'm coming from, which is Sarajevo, Bosnia-Hercegovina, former Yugoslavia, of course, I try not to be obsessed with the problems we experienced during, as I call it, one of the bloodiest war in the 20th century when it comes to hate speech and what hate speech actually can provoke and can do in a society that is in conflict, pre-conflict, but also post-conflict. I built my career working on the issues on how to combat and how to deal with hate speech, not only in the Balkans, but also later on in the countries like Iraq, Jordan, Morocco, and some other parts of the world. Many studies, as you know, and researches about the role of media in ex-Yugoslav conflict were undoubtedly indicating that media were, while serving the regimes, produced wars and hatred. In the book that I always quote when I talk about hate speech and the impact that hate speech has in society, I always mention the book of Mark Thompson, Forging the War. And in his book he stated that verbal violence produced physical violence in former Yugoslavia, and that war was firstly it started in media. There were other scholars and journalists, for example, Italian Paolo Ramirez, who wrote in his book One Massacre that the war was already present in 90s in headlines and in articles in former Yugoslavia. At a time of war, many journalists' articles were dominated by ideological consciousness based on execution of political plans rather than professionalism and objectivity. Facts in these articles were interpreted very wrong, and they had a form of arbitrary constructions, cleverly designed to achieve political interest. Although there is no doubt that the media really did play one of the key and dirtiest roles in the conflicts in the region of the former Yugoslavia, I also have to stress here something that is very much related to the work I'm doing now, that they were only an instrument of politics under its greater or lesser control. In any case, an instrument, not an autonomous creator of a conflict. There is no doubt that this primacy belongs to politics, and this is something that I try to repeat all the time when I'm discussing the issue of hate speech and media and pre- and post-conflict societies. Definition of hate speech, I will not go into this area, as we know that there are several definitions that international organizations, scholars around the world are trying to tell us how we can define hate speech. I'm, in a way, very much against any defining or any definition of hate speech. The way I try to explain it when I talk to students or when I talk to people that are eager to listen about the experience, I always say, you know, you can feel it. It's plastic. Are you scared when you hear something? Must be hate speech. Do you have to define it? Not really. How to tackle it? I don't know. There are many examples. I mean, we heard several excellent examples and also proposals or views in the first panel. And I'm also ready to maybe give the audience more time in order for them for you to engage and to ask, so we can continue discussion in a different directions, rather than listening to certain experiences or certain issues that I could or can raise during this session. But what I would also like to mention is that what we always see, and in a way is very present in all the talks and discussions related to hate speech, is that this mechanism of self-fulfilling prophecy, if I can call it like this, explains how prejudice can poison relations between, as they always say in hate speech, we groups and other groups. In Bosnian we say us and them. So who are us and who are them and who are we? In order to say who is right and who is wrong.
That's not a hate speech.
Or my inner voice coming over.
Oh, sorry.
Oh no, that was Miklos, he's there. Don't worry. And the principle of this self-fulfilling prophecy, known also as the theorem of Thomas, which I also quote in all my speeches and in presentation, and it really holds: if men define situations as real, they are real in their consequences. The theorem spells out that human beings are capable of reflections, and this reflection further influences their behavior. The mutual perception of these so-called we groups and other groups are based on a process of social interaction always. And if any other groups is viewed by a we group as hostile or aggressive, it is very likely individuals from other groups, when encounter negative attitudes, in turn to behave aggressively. Thus, they would confirm in the eyes of the we group negative stereotypes and prejudices. And we can go on and on about this. So many excellent scholars wrote about this, and they offered us certain formulas or patterns. And we all know that what we need to do is we need to invest more in literacy, in education, in promoting tolerance and promoting education. I spent 10 years of my professional career in the Balkans trying to tackle these issues. We were working on establishing independent judiciary, independent regulation, press council, self-regulatory bodies, codes of ethics, voluntary codes of ethics, following the case law of European Court of Human Rights and international courts. Did we manage to change something? Unfortunately, not much. This is also very frustrating for me to say. If I look back and I look all the energy and the dedication and the time people internationally but also locally put in order to try to fight this phenomena in a society that is complex and is going from one period of horrible war to the post-conflict. There was kind of light at the end of tunnel in 2000. In those years, there was a possibility, or we could see the possibility, that these issues could be tackled. But at the moment, I cannot say that I'm optimistic, because the political forces are not actually doing anything in order to promote a way forward or to do something, even if we have cases of international courts, but also local ones, stating clearly what was happening and the processes that were also led by certain issues in relation to hate speech. I will also mention one particular thing which I think is very important, and it was actually triggered by Sanja in a previous panel with her questions. She mentioned internet. Otherwise, I will continue talking about former Yugoslavia. That will become maybe too emotional, which I do not want to do. But I would mention the recent attempts by Facebook, many of you probably heard about this, to tackle hate speech by themselves. I don't know how much you know about this, but it's called the Facebook's content policy, a new Facebook content policy, and the current concern that they were voiced by Women Action and the Media, the Everyday Sexism Project, and the coalition that is quite big that they represent. And they focused on the content on the Facebook that targets women with images and content that threatens or incites gender-based violence or hate. And this is something that happened last week. So we see, that there is a thinking around the world, and there are attempts in order to try to address the issues of hate speech, no matter, it doesn't have to be related to conflict or war. We do not lack problems when it comes to speech. Can words kill? The book is written excellent book by Dusan Redic, also tackling the issues not only about the war, but also about all these other issues that you use when you try to explain hate speech. And I will close here without talking about Facebook, which I think is extremely important and something that we should at least start discussing how they are going to deal with this, and is this something that should be welcomed, or it's a Pandora's box or a mission impossible? I'm not sure. But the manipulation of hate speech and targeting any kind of speech, even provocative or political, or vulgar or sensitive as hate speech, is also something that I think needs attention, because it's very seen in the job that I'm performing now, that anything that certain governments do not like, anything that they see that could in a way undermine their authority or power, immediately it's called hate speech, and we should fight it and we should stop it. But my answer to this is that they should stop acting like this, because that doesn't bring anything.
Thank you very much. The next contribution is from John Shattuck, who is not only the president and rector of the university and a professor at legal studies, but a person who started his career as a lawyer for a very prestigious human rights organization. John.
Thank you, Renata, and thank you, Dunja, for all that you're doing. We've been following your work here at CU for the last several years, and it's been a privilege to have you here. And I want to pick up on your last point, which is, and I'm going to cycle back into it during my remarks again, but I think it's an extremely important point, which is the danger of putting in the hands of government the ability to criminalize or restrain freedom of speech is a very important principle that we need to understand, because in the hands of the wrong governments, and it's usually the wrong governments that are trying to say how much they're doing to criminalize hate speech, we have unleashed a very dangerous element against the possibility of reform. So I think you made that point briefly, and I underscore it because it's very important. My perspective on this comes, not surprisingly, from my long career in American civil rights. As Renata has said in introducing me, I have been wearing a number of hats over the years, but above all, I've been a civil liberties lawyer, which means that I've really defended those against whom the power of government has been focused to try to prevent them from speaking or otherwise petitioning the government for reform or taking contrary and difficult positions. Fortunately, in the United States, this freedom of speech is protected directly in the US Constitution, as you know, where the very First Amendment to the Constitution provides that Congress shall make no law, making it very clear that no law should be passed abridging the freedom of speech or of the press, or the right of the people peaceably to assemble or petition their government for redress of grievances. Basically, no law that should limit the ability of people to exercise their basic freedoms of speech. Now, the cases that I was involved in the early stages of my career were people who were either trying to publicize information that was very important to get out, such as the so-called Pentagon Papers, which involved a major history of American involvement in Vietnam, which the government tried to prevent from publishing. And we went to the courts, and the courts upheld our claim that this was an exercise of freedom of speech, and the people had the right to get access to this information, and there should be no prior restraint against the publication of that information in a major newspaper, two major newspapers, the New York Times and the Washington Post. I was also involved in defending an organization that had been started by Martin Luther King and then continued after his assassination, which sought to march through Cicero, Illinois, which is a suburb of Chicago, where there was a lot of resistance to the civil rights developments. There were a lot of people who were expressing racist opinions in that town. And Cicero tried to prevent this march from taking place. And we went to court to say that it's very important that civil rights demonstrators be able to take their message even into the heart of their opponents. I was also involved in a much more controversial case, at least from the point of view, I think, of myself and everyone in this room, I'm sure, which involved in a town very close to Cicero, Illinois, Skokie, Illinois, an effort by a small group of Nazi demonstrators to march through a town, Skokie, which had a large Jewish population and in fact had quite a number of survivors of the Holocaust. I'm going to come back to that in a minute. I don't want to get stuck on it because I want to take you to the next element of my background, which helps inform where I stand on these issues, and that is I was a US government official working in the human rights field, and I was particularly involved in the efforts to address the catastrophic events in both Rwanda and in Bosnia. And it was there, I think, that Dunja and I may have first initially met. In any event, I greatly admire her background as a Bosnian person who's been involved in these efforts for so many years to try to end a genocide. In any event, you can imagine my perspective as a lawyer who had worked on these cases that I just described to you. And I come up against Radio Mil Colline, which is broadcasting out of Kigali in Rwanda, messages of pure hate, which were boiled down to basically go kill the cockroaches. Cockroaches, as we heard from the earlier panel, was a euphemism for the Rwandan Tutsis. And this was broadcast out in a way that made people fear that if they didn't participate in the genocide, they themselves would be killed. Well, I made an effort, along with other government officials, to get the US Pentagon to jam the radio, to prevent freedom of speech in this case, because this clearly represented not only an imminent danger, but a real and direct and overwhelming instigation of the genocide. In the same way, when I was involved in the events to try to end the war in Yugoslavia, and specifically Bosnia, I and several other officials petitioned NATO to dismantle the radio tower from Radio Pale, which was a radio that was being broadcast just 30 or 40 kilometers away from Sarajevo. Similar kind of hate speech, in this case anti-Muslim and anti-Bosniak speech. So I agreed that that was an entirely appropriate limit and an important effort by government to make to ban that type of speech in these two situations involving genocide and crimes against humanity. I was also earlier involved as an official in Harvard University, where in my earlier time as a university administrator, and I was there during the 1990s and early and late 80s when there was an effort to enact a speech code on campus to basically prevent certain types of racial and gender slurs that were being certainly were seen to be a real problem on the campus. The code was ultimately rejected by I think the majority of students and the faculty, and certainly the president. And instead, what we did was to have a series of events and actions by university officials and faculty members condemning racist, sexist, and other forms of hate speech as they occurred at that very moment, not simply kind of after the fact from a theoretical basis. So, as you can see, I come at this from several different points of view, but underneath it all, I do feel that freedom of speech is the most fundamental element to an open society. And I think the question that we have here today is, what are the forms of hate speech, the speech that present an imminent threat to open society, perhaps not as extreme as the two examples that I cited in Rwanda and Bosnia, but nonetheless where we have to be mindful of the dangers, as Dunja has pointed out, of giving government, particularly repressive government, the power to repress speech by effectively criminalizing it or exercising a prior restraint to prohibit speech from being made. So it's a complicated topic. Let me just quickly return to the US legal tradition, which is the tradition from which I draw my position on this. And the leading case, which may have been cited by the earlier panel, involved a Ku Klux Klan rally in Ohio. I think you all know the racist elements of the Ku Klux Klan. It was essentially the principal organization that was operating in many ways throughout the United States during the civil rights period and earlier to intimidate civil rights activists. The Klan leader was convicted in this case under a state law for, and I quote, advocating terrorism as a means of accomplishing political reform, close quote. Now, the US Supreme Court unanimously held that his conviction was unconstitutional under the First Amendment. Surprising, perhaps, given the nature of the Klan and its operations in the country. But they were mindful of the dangers that I've just cited of giving government too much power in this area and the importance of freedom of speech. And they made clear that there was no evidence that the rally that took place was likely to produce imminent lawless action. No one was attending it who was not a member of this group. And they also held that the conviction was based entirely on the content of the speech, not on its direct effect. So essentially they said, even though clearly it was a totally objectionable and repugnant form of speech, it should not be prohibited and made a crime under the First Amendment to the Constitution. The court also said, and this is very important, it's one of our themes, I think, throughout this conference, that the remedy in many cases for this kind of speech is to have a government and a civil society that takes action immediately, as we did, I think, at the Harvard cases that I was citing, to condemn racism, to begin the process of education against racism, or obviously any other forms of invidious discrimination, to enact legislation against racial discrimination or other forms of invidious discrimination. And that, in fact, in this case, was what was done in Ohio, because it was soon after this Supreme Court decision that the Ohio legislature enacted a strong civil rights law, which is probably the best possible response to the Ku Klux Klan, far better than criminalizing their speech and essentially promoting the kind of controversy that they themselves were trying to promote. So that is, I think, a very good summary of, I mean, at least the Supreme Court's decision, not necessarily my words, but the summary of this U.S. and American tradition. Now, I fully recognize that this tradition is not necessarily applicable, or probably not at all applicable in international context, particularly where courts are weak and are not able to strike down these kinds of limitations on speech. However, and I really I hate to keep hate is the wrong word, excuse me. I'm sorry to keep drawing Dunja back into my presentation, but she made, I think, the critical point at the end, which is, in some ways, what I'm saying is universal, because there is a universal danger that when you give government the power to censor, to give prior restraint, or even worse, to criminalize certain types of speech, you're basically giving government the power to repress. And here I would say, referring to the circumstances in Hungary and perhaps in other countries that are within your mandate, what we have is governments that are very happy to adopt hate crimes and to say, look what we've done. We have prohibited anti-Roma, anti-gay, anti-this, anti-that speech. They aren't happy enough. They don't do it enough, to be sure. But, and then, out of the other side of their mouth, they are either stimulating the very forms of discrimination and racism and homophobia that we often see. So beware, there is a great danger, and in this case I think the American experience is universal, in providing, giving the government the authority to criminalize speech. Now there are many things that need to be done, and it can be done to address hate speech. Broadest approach, of course, is education. And I think here we see again in Hungary some of the really dangerous aspects of what's happening in the schools. It's going the opposite direction. So if there is a criminalization of hate speech in legislation, at the same time there are various elements of education that may in fact stimulate more hate speech. So that's a problem. But beyond education, there is leadership. Political leadership, leadership that needs to stand up in the moment something happens, like the statement that was made 3 months ago in, I think it was Magyar, relating to a Roma perspective on what Roma were, calling Roma animals and almost nothing good about them. That needed to be confronted immediately by political leadership. Or the statement that was made in the Hungarian parliament some months prior, which actually was confronted, relating to anti-Semitism, a call for by a member of the far-right party for a particular list of Jews who were serving in the Hungarian government. That was actually rejected, and there was a strong condemnation by the Hungarian government, and I credit them with that. I think that's exactly the kind of thing that was needed. So these are the remedies, in my view, for hate speech, not criminal penalties or prior restraint. Now, I recognize that this is a much more complicated topic in some ways than certainly the way I've presented it. But I wanted to make this point in order to push the argument a little bit further toward a recognition of the importance of speech to democracy, the dangers of giving government too much power to regulate speech, and the importance of political, civil society, and other forms of leadership in confronting hate speech the moment that it's spoken, which I think was your point earlier. So, thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And now let me give the floor to case anyone who is senior fellow at CMCS and one of the editors of the book Around for Conferences was actually organized.
Thank you, Renata, and if I will receive a little technical help, I will project the picture as an example, if maybe just later than during the question time. And just want to say at the beginning, I'm so happy that we can discuss it with Dunja and John and all other wonderful friends who took the time to be panelists and moderators, and all of you who came. And at this point of the discussion, I would like to continue what Dunja and John said with 3 points on 3 words, starting with I: incitement, intent, and imminence. And first, incitement is I want to emphasize this word because although many regulations, international and national, uses the language incitement to hatred and then provide a content-based concept of restriction based on this wording, incitement still expresses that the speech is sort of inciting some sort of rather tangible consequences of the speech, as opposed to when we talk about quote-unquote, what I say, quote-unquote hate speech, which might or might not cause such result. So, and as I said earlier, I think there is a choice. And it seems that the international documents, the Robot Plan of Action, and other international documents and suggestions by international NGOs like Article 19 are kind of struggling on this crossroad and try to combine the elements of content and context. And I'm glad that it comes up a lot because it's not by accident, of course, that we put it into the title of the book. And I still think, of course, considering all the arguments that it's all what we just heard during the discussion until now, that it's always a combination of content and context. But I still think that it's a choice whether we rely on mostly the content or the context. If we rely mostly on the content, then let's imagine we are judges. We have a case like what John mentioned, that there is this article calling Roma people, many Roma people in Hungary are animals, they should not be here, they should not exist here, we should solve that by any means. If we are told as judges by the literature, scholarly literature about it, and public discourse, that in Hungary we should just not tolerate such a language because it's dehumanizing, obviously, it's so awful, it's so racist, then the judgment should be that we ban it because of the very ugly content. And the other approach, and this is still, it's in a context. Of course, as judges, we would have it in mind that ugly speech is uttered in the current context in Hungary. But the other approaches would tell us as judges that we don't ban it because it's ugly. We recognize that it's ugly, but we respond to it not by banning it. In a way, we don't do the favor to it to ban it and make the speaker a martyr, and I can list the counter-arguments, but I don't go into that. But so the other approach is saying we ban it if it causes imminent danger, because then there is no time to respond otherwise. So this is what I would call in a way the incitement approach, and here the likeliness matters. So here what matters is not how ugly, again, the speech is. It matters that whether it's likely enough that imminent violence can follow. And if it is likely, then however firm defenders of freedom of speech we should just support police prosecution and judgment by criminal court against the speaker. I think it's hard to say it as a free speech defender, but there are cases when we have to do. So that's one thing, and then this is, as I said, my problem with the robot plan of action, that I think it's not clear enough about this choice, and I would still love to hear about the others that and everyone in the room, that what you think, whether you agree there is a choice in that way as I described, or not, and what would be your choice if you agree. And then a bit more briefly on the other two words, intent and imminence. It came up already that intent is seems to be required as an element of the crime if we want to prohibit incitement to hatred. And again, as a free speech advocate, I want to question that. And let me quote here in my ACLU t-shirt, which I put on, of course, intentionally to respond
I hadn't seen that. Very good.
to respond to government and all governments on earth which tells its critics that you are not real patriots, you are not real Hungarians, real Bosnians, real Americans if you criticize us, the government. So, and the third way of bringing in the American Civil Liberties Union, besides John and my t-shirt, is a quote from the book with the interview that Nadine Strossen gave to me, who was president of the American Civil Liberties Union for a long time, almost 2 decades, and the first woman who was president of the ACLU. And if you read the book all the way to page 396, Nadine says, about intent, I think we agree conceptually, it might be surprising, but she says, I think we agree conceptually that it can be more than negligence and less than specific intent. So that's something to think about, I think, when an ACLU person says that, less than specific intent, because there, and it's again about context, you can imagine situations, extreme right-wing paramilitary people are rattling around the houses of Roma Hungarians, or we could imagine other cultural contexts as well. But let me use that example because that's so worrisome right now in Hungary and elsewhere in the region. Someone shouts some anti-Roma statement and later says, I just wanted to express my opinion. I didn't mean to incite those people who were standing next to me with stones in hand, looking angrily at the Roma children and others around the houses. Should we take that? Or should we at least say that the judge should be able to infer intent and say that it was intentional? Or should the judge be able to say that it was such a reckless disregard that I just don't take it as a defense, that it was not intentional. And finally, about imminence. That's also an important thing, and I really think, and try to write in my chapter in the book about it, that we really need to be able to tell what sort of imminence we require. Otherwise, we have articles like what John mentioned that about Roma, or the anti-Semitic speech in Parliament, or the picture that I will project at some point, which says that all Jews are, it was on the internet, that all Jews are murderers and terrorists. If you kill a Jew, you haven't lived in vain. So it's basically a call for murdering Jewish people in Hungarian language. And there are some Orthodox Jews on the Jewish people on the picture. It was on the Kurutz.info website, an infamous racist website. So, for example, what do you think about imminence in that context? And here I quote Nadine again. She says in the book, you have to look at any particular context. You only suppress the speech or punish the speaker as a last resort if that's the only way to prevent violence. There is not so much a time limitation as there is a context-specific functional limitation. I love this. This is so specific. A context-specific functional limitation. Anti-Islamic or anti-Hindu speech or the Mohammed cartoons in Pakistan or India could likely be very different in terms of the likelihood of imminent violence than the same publication in the United States or in Denmark. So, please think about these examples. Can we say that, okay, that speech was in parliament, or that article talking about Roma Hungarians as animals who should not be here was in an article both in print and online, or this calling for killing Jewish people as a purpose of life was on the internet? Can we say that it's not imminent? Can we say it because we would think that, okay, it is not happening in a context like neo-Nazis are rallying around the houses of Roma Hungarians, so it's online, so there is time to respond? Or should we consider also the broader environment, the whole environment in the specific country? For example, in Hungary, that we have a rather strong extreme right-wing party which is openly advocating its racist ideas and sort of calling for action as well. So I think actually that it was a mistake in Hungary that the investigation was rather short-handedly stopped in the case of that anti-Roma article which said any Romas are animals and they should not be here. I thought it was far too quick to decide for the authorities to say that we don't even investigate it. We don't need to take it up for the courts. We don't need to take it for a judge or a panel of judges to decide whether it was imminent danger or not. And I want to close just with a technical point to show how little details matter in this. I think so we are talking about, I was talking about some examples which were online content. So if you think about it, like even some years ago, it was more likely that some people with racist prejudices would look at the online content at home and later sometimes would show up at a place where the context was so inflammatory that there would be imminent danger. So there was some distance. But with the iPhones and all sorts of mobile electronic devices, people just pull out that instrument and right there, where they are rallying around the minority neighborhood, they just look up what their favorite racist website says or anti-LGBTQ website says, and they read that you should do this or that if you are a good Hungarian or a good whatever. So to close with one sentence, my choice, I think it's a choice between the content-based approach and the context-based approach. My choice so far, but you are making me think about all sorts of considerations, and so I am struggling. But my choice so far is the context-based approach. But I am going to argue that the context-based approach, which is going to prohibit some speech because it causes imminent danger, and not necessarily imminent danger of violence only, but perhaps imminent danger of discrimination, because that's lawless action as well, and the Brandenburg case uses the word lawless action. Then I want us to tell what cases are covered by that, and I am going to make that test a little bit broader. I see the danger of making it broader. I want to be very careful with it, but I want us to think about it that an online article calling Roma people animals and calling for immediate solutions to make the country free of them, even if it's online, I think it might be imminent danger. I am open for counter-arguments, but I think it's something to think about it. Otherwise, we didn't take thinking about the details of the test seriously. And this way, I think we can bring the two tests actually closer to each other. The context-based test would still cover less than the content-based test, but I think it's safer because it is subject to less risk of abuse. It's not free of risk of abuse, but there is somewhat less risk of abuse with the context-based test. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. And finally, let's